She was about to eat her last meal and then die. In a land baked dry under divine judgment, where even the sky seemed shut tight, a woman with no name, no money, and no hope was preparing for the end. The wind hissed through cracked mud brick houses. A child's eyes pleaded for something that simply wasn't there anymore. The flour barely dusted the bottom of the bowl. The oil was just a thin stain clinging to the inside of the jar. And that was it. That was everything. They were alone, forgotten, waiting for hunger to finish what the drought had started. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the God of Israel, the very same God who had closed the heavens over a rebellious nation, was about to step straight into her ordinary, miserable routine with a command from heaven. And her simple obedience, yes, her obedience with almost nothing in her hands would become the kind of story that shocks kings, silences idols, and echoes for generations. This is the overlooked story of the widow of Zarephath. And before we go any further, if you enjoy deep cinematic Bible stories like this, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this one starts small, and then it gets intense. So let's set the scene. We're in Zarephath, a foreign town, pagan territory, not Israel, not the place you'd expect God to send his prophet. Which raises the question, why would God send Elijah there? Because Israel was collapsing into darkness. King Ahab had married Jezebel, and with that marriage came altars to Baal, shrines, priests, and the slow poisoning of an entire nation. People who once belonged to the living God traded their covenant for compromise. They swapped worship for superstition. They chose alliances with demons over loyalty to the Creator. So God responded. The sky went silent. No rain, no dew, nothing. The ground split open. Crops failed. Animals dropped in the fields. Desperation spread like fire in dry grass. And in the middle of this judgment, God protected Elijah first by a brook, where ravens brought him food. But even that brook dried up. And then came the word of the Lord, "Get up, go to Zarephath. I have commanded a widow there to sustain you." A widow in a foreign land? Among pagans? Among enemies? In the territory connected to Jezebel herself? Yes, and Elijah obeyed. He walks toward the entrance of the city, dust on his sandals, sun overhead, famine in every face he passes. And right there near the gate he sees her. A woman, thin from hunger, eyes hollow, shoulders heavy, moving slowly like every step costs her something. She's gathering sticks, just 2 small pieces of wood, because she doesn't need a lot for what she's about to do. She's about to make one final fire, one final meal. And then, nothing. Elijah approaches and speaks. "Please bring me a little water in a cup so I can drink." Water is precious, but she turns to go, maybe out of habit, maybe out of what little kindness she has left. And then Elijah calls after her, "And bring me a piece of bread too." And she stops. You can almost feel that moment, that freeze, that sting. Because water is one thing painful but possible. But bread, she turns back with a look that says, "You don't understand what you're asking me." And she answers with a vow so serious, so raw that it cuts through the air. "As the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a bowl, and a little oil in a jar. I'm gathering a couple sticks so I can go in and prepare it for myself and my son, so we may eat it and die." That's not exaggeration. That's her plan. She isn't being dramatic. She isn't being poetic. She's being honest. This is the final line. Now pause right here because this is where the whole story turns. In front of her stands a prophet of the God of Israel. A stranger. A man asking for food when she has barely enough to keep her child alive for one more meal. And she has a choice. Obey and risk everything, or refuse and watch her son waste away anyway. Either way, she's staring death in the face. What would you do? Because from her perspective, Elijah's request feels unreasonable, almost cruel, like someone demanding a tithe from an empty wallet, like someone asking for your last breath. But Elijah looks at her, steady, serious, and he says something she probably didn't expect. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. With a famine outside, with a child at home, with death knocking on the door. But Elijah continues, Go and do what you said. Go and do what you said, but first, make a small loaf for me and bring it out. After that, make something for yourself and your son. And then Elijah speaks the words that change everything. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The flour in the bowl will not run out, and the oil in the jar will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Imagine hearing that. She doesn't have a Bible in her hands. She doesn't have a history with Israel's God. She doesn't have a long list of miracles to cling to. All she has is a command and a promise. And something about that moment, maybe the authority in Elijah's voice, maybe the weight of heaven behind his words, sparks a flicker of faith inside her. So she goes. She walks back into her little home. She looks at her child. She looks at the bowl. She looks at the jar. And she makes the bread. And she gives it to Elijah. That's obedience. Not obedience when you have extra. Obedience when you have almost nothing. And that's when the impossible begins. She turns back to the bowl, and there's flour. She checks the jar, and there's oil. Not overflowing, not flashy, not some dramatic explosion of provision. It's quiet. It's just there. Enough. The next day again. The next day again, and the next. Day after day, the flour doesn't run out. The oil doesn't fail. The famine is still happening outside those walls, but inside that small home, death is being pushed back one meal at a time. Think about that. A nameless widow in a forgotten town becomes the safest place in the region because God moved into her kitchen. Days pass, weeks, maybe even months. Hope returns slowly, not because life became easy, but because God proved faithful in the smallest, most practical way. Breakfast, dinner, another meal, another day alive. But then, the story takes a turn that no one expects. Because even in a house where God is providing bread, tragedy can still find the door. Her son gets sick. At first, maybe it seems normal, like a fever, like a weak cough. But then it worsens. Fast. His breathing becomes shallow. His eyes lose focus. And then, he stops breathing altogether. Silence. The same child she had watched starve through drought, the same child whose life had been preserved by miracle, now lies still. And in that moment, every question floods her heart at once. Why would God save us? Just to take him now? Was the miracle a setup? Was this mercy or cruelty disguised as hope? She grabs her son's lifeless body, and she storms to Elijah with grief boiling into accusation. "What do you have against me, man of God?" she cries. "Did you come here to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah doesn't argue with her. He doesn't snap back. He doesn't say, "How dare you talk to a prophet like that?" He just feels the full weight of her pain, and he responds in the most human way possible. "Give me your son." And with that, he takes the boy's lifeless body into his arms. Imagine how heavy that moment is. This isn't just a story beat. This is a mother handing over the one person she has left in the world, the child she just watched die in her home. And now the prophet she trusted is holding him, walking away, up the stairs, into the upper room. Elijah carries the boy into the place where he's been staying. He lays him on the bed. And then this is so important, Elijah does something that shocks a lot of people. He doesn't instantly declare victory. He doesn't act like he has control. He doesn't treat this like a performance. He cries out to God. And his prayer isn't polished. It's not religious sounding. It's raw. "Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on this widow I'm staying with by killing her son? Do you hear what's happening? Elijah is not pretending he understands. He's not pretending this makes sense. He's bringing the confusion straight to God. And that right there is something a lot of people need to hear. Because faith doesn't mean you never ask why. Faith means you bring your why to the only one who can answer. Then Elijah does something even more intense. He stretches over the child 3 times, covering the boy with his body as he tries to help him. And he cries out again, desperate now, pleading, "Lord my God, I pray, let this boy's life return to him." And then, silence. You can almost feel the pause. 1 second, 2, 3. Nothing moves, no breath, no sound. Just the stillness of death. And if you've ever prayed over something that felt dead, something that felt beyond saving, you know that silence can be terrifying. But then, the impossible happens. The boy takes a breath. Air fills his lungs. Life returns. And in that moment, this isn't just a miracle in a small house. It's a declaration, a statement, a message. Because Baal was worshipped as a storm god, a giver of rain, a source of fertility, a power of life. But in a town tied to Jezebel's world, the God of Israel is proving something with brutal clarity. Rain isn't the only thing Baal can't control. Life itself belongs to the Lord. Elijah lifts the boy up. He holds him close. And he walks back down the stairs, step by step, bringing life back into the room where grief was crushing everything. He returns the child to his mother and says, "Look, your son is alive." Can you imagine her face? Just moments ago, she was screaming in pain, accusing Elijah, drowning in questions. Now she's holding her living child again, warm, breathing, real, and she falls apart. But this time it's not only grief. It's awe, it's fear, it's certainty. She looks at Elijah and says, "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth." That line is huge, because this widow didn't grow up with Israel's stories. She didn't have the temple. She didn't have the prophets. She didn't have the covenant. But she has something now that can't be taken away. Personal proof. She has seen the God of Israel provide when there was nothing, and she has seen the God of Israel give life when death had already won. So what was all of this about? Why would God multiply flour and oil only to allow the child to die? Why give hope and then let it get crushed? Here's what the story forces us to wrestle with. God's provision is real, but it's not a guarantee that pain won't still visit your house. And God's silence in a moment of tragedy doesn't mean he has stopped being God. Sometimes the Lord doesn't only want to show you that he can provide. Sometimes he wants to show you that he is the source, not just the source of bread, the source of life. This woman's story is so powerful that centuries later, Jesus himself brings her up. He mentions her when talking about how Israel, in the days of Elijah, had many widows, but Elijah wasn't sent to them. He was sent to her, a foreigner, a woman outside the expected group, an unlikely person in an unlikely place. And that detail is not random, because God has always been the kind of God who moves toward the overlooked. He reaches for the outsider. He chooses what people ignore. He loves showing up in places nobody would put on the map. And the widow of Zarephath proves that God is not limited by borders, status, or background. Now, let's land this story with 3 eternal truths hidden inside it, because they're not just nice points. These are the kind of truths that change how you walk through scarcity, fear, and pain. First, God chooses the forgotten to humble the powerful. While kings like Ahab were sitting in palaces, corrupting a nation, while Jezebel was pushing Baal worship into the bloodstream of Israel, God wasn't looking for a throne. He went looking for a kitchen, a simple house, a widow with no name and no influence, because the Lord loves doing this. He bypasses the loud and the famous, and he finds the brokenhearted. He finds the humble. He finds the person who thinks they have nothing to offer, and then he makes that person the stage for his glory. Second, Obedience in scarcity is where miracles begin. She didn't give because she had extra. She gave because she trusted the word she heard. Her obedience wasn't comfortable, it wasn't safe, it was costly. She literally gave what looked like her final meal. And the moment she released it, God started multiplying what she couldn't create. Not in a flashy way, not in a look-at-me way, but in a faithful, daily, quiet way. Enough flour, enough oil, enough to make it through one more day. And that's how God often works. Not always with instant overflow, but with sustained provision. He keeps you standing. He keeps you breathing. He keeps you moving forward, one day at a time. Third, sometimes God tests our faith right before deliverance. This is the hardest one. She obeyed, she believed, she saw the miracle of provision. And then the boy died. And that moment exposes something in all of us. Were we trusting the miracle or the God who does miracles? Because sometimes the Lord allows something to stop breathing in our lives, not because He's cruel, but because He's revealing where our foundation really is. If your faith only survives when the jar is full, what happens when the jar is empty again? But if your faith is in the living God, then even when something dies, you still have the one who resurrects. This widow, poor, foreign, forgotten, never could have imagined her home would become the scene of one of Scripture's most powerful moments. She didn't know her faith would echo through time. She didn't know Jesus would mention her centuries later. But her story stands as proof that when everything looks finished, God might just be getting started. So let me ask you the same question the story asks all of us. What would you do if God asked you for your last piece of bread? Not your leftovers, not your extra, your last. That thing you've been holding tightly because you're afraid there won't be more. Would you obey? Would you trust? Because the widow's story says something loud and clear. God still steps into simple houses. God still hears desperate prayers. God still provides when it doesn't make sense. And God still breathes life into what everyone else has already called dead. If you want more stories like this, hidden miracles, overlooked characters, moments that reveal who God really is, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like if you believe God still moves today. And I want you to comment below. What's the most unforgettable miracle God has done in your life? And share this with someone who needs to remember, right now, that heaven still responds.